How does it feel to be a loser? My daughter-in-law's smirk cut through the dinner table as everyone erupted in laughter. Everyone except me. I just smiled and asked back, "How does it feel to know that this loser knows what you did in Chicago?" Her confident expression froze completely, the color draining from her face in seconds. The entire table went dead silent as her eyes darted toward my son. You won't believe what she did next. Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The Sunday dinner had been progressing as usual until Jessica decided to raise her wine glass in that mock toast. The Waterford crystal caught the chandelier light as she smiled that smile I'd come to know so well over the past 3 years. "To all the hard-working people who actually contribute to society," she'd said, her eyes narrowing as they fixed on mine. Then came the question that would change everything. "How does it feel to be a loser?" she smirked. The table erupted in laughter, everyone except me. Michael's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his eyebrows raised. My daughter Sarah's laugh came out sharp and forced, her fingers gripping her napkin. She'd driven up from Portland with her husband Tom for our weekly family dinner. Tom cleared his throat and took a long sip of wine, clearly uncomfortable. Even Emma, Michael's 16-year-old daughter from his first marriage, let out a small giggle before her eyes dropped to her plate, her cheeks flushing pink. But I just smiled and asked back, "How does it feel to know that this loser knows what you did in Chicago?" Her confident expression froze completely, the color draining from her face in seconds. The entire table went dead silent as her eyes darted toward my son. What she did next surprised even me. Her hand began trembling so violently that dark red wine sloshed against the crystal rim. She opened her mouth twice, no sound emerging, before finally whispering, I don't know what you're talking about." The laughter died instantly. Michael set down his fork with a soft clink against his plate. I'd been sitting at this same mahogany table for the past 3 years, every Sunday evening, watching Jessica perfect her performance. Tonight had started no differently. She'd complimented my shirt while suggesting I might find more age-appropriate colors. She'd asked about my job while mentioning how nice it must be to have simple responsibilities. But tonight was different. Tonight, I'd come prepared. I'd served my country overseas, raised my children alone after Linda died, worked 3 jobs to put Michael through engineering school. The manila envelope crinkled as I pulled it from my jacket pocket. Jessica's eyes locked onto it. I placed it on the table between the crystal candlesticks and her perfect white orchid centerpiece. "Dad," Michael said, his voice careful, controlled. "What are you talking about?" Jessica was in Chicago for work. She showed me the contracts when she got back. Jessica straightened in her chair, her hands smoothing her skirt. "Robert, you're scaring me a little. Remember last month when you were so sure Mrs. Henderson was taking your newspaper?" She reached across to pat my hand, but I pulled back. "Sometimes stress affects our memory. It's perfectly normal at your age." Emma's phone disappeared under the table. Sarah's fingers drummed against her water glass. Tom studied the pattern on his dinner plate like it held state secrets. "Memory's a funny thing, Jessica," I said, my hand steady as I reached for the envelope. "Sometimes photographs help clarify things." Her hand froze halfway to her wine glass. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed to echo through the sudden silence. 27 years ago, I held my newborn son in the sterile white hallway of St. Mary's Hospital while my wife Linda fought for her life just 30 feet away. The doctors had given her a choice: terminate the pregnancy to save herself or risk everything to bring our child into the world. She'd looked at me with those fierce green eyes and whispered, "This baby is our future, Robert. Promise me you'll make sure he has everything." Linda's hand went cold in mine 3 hours after Michael drew his first breath. I'd kept that promise through 18 years of single parenthood. While other men my age climbed corporate ladders, I packed lunchboxes at 5 in the morning before my shift at the water treatment plant, raced home to help with homework, then headed out to clean offices downtown until midnight. Weekends meant construction gigs while Michael played Little League, me cheering from the sidelines with drywall dust still caked under my fingernails. Michael never saw the sacrifice. I'd made sure of that. When he needed a graphing calculator for advanced math, I sold my father's watch without mentioning it. When he wanted to join the debate team that required travel, I delivered newspapers before dawn for 6 months. The day he got accepted to State University with a partial scholarship, I sat in my truck outside the house for 10 minutes, watching the steering wheel blur through my tears, knowing I'd have to mortgage everything Linda and I had built together. But Michael graduated summa cum laude. He landed his engineering job before graduation day. By 25, he was making more money than I'd seen in any single year of my life. He bought the house in Maple Ridge with the wrought iron gates and manicured lawns where doctors and lawyers lived. When Michael introduced me to Jessica 3 years ago, I'd opened my heart to her like she was the daughter I'd never had. I taught her how to fix the garbage disposal when it jammed. I drove 40 minutes through a snowstorm to jumpstart her car when the battery died. When she mentioned wanting to learn basic home maintenance, I spent 3 Saturdays showing her how to patch drywall and unclog drains, patiently explaining each step twice. "You're like the father I never really had," she'd said that first Christmas, hugging me tight after I'd assembled Emma's new bike while she and Michael were at midnight mass. Dad was always too busy with work to teach me anything practical. I'd felt such warmth that night, such hope that our family was finally complete. The first subtle dig came 6 months later. "Oh, Robert, you're so handy with blue-collar things," she'd said when I fixed their running toilet, her tone suggesting my skills were quaint but primitive. I'd brushed it off. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Then came the comments about my adorable work clothes when I'd show up straight from a job site, the way she'd redirect conversations when I tried to share advice about home repairs with their friends, the gradual transition from Dad to Robert to barely acknowledging my presence when her social circle was around. But I'd made excuses for her. She was young, still adjusting to having a father figure. She came from money. Maybe she just didn't understand the value of practical skills. I'd bitten my tongue when she suggested I might be more comfortable eating in the kitchen during their dinner parties. I'd smiled and nodded when she gently redirected Michael away from asking my opinion on major purchases. The wedding planning had been my first real glimpse behind the mask. I'd offered to contribute what I could, maybe pay for the flowers or the photographer. Jessica had looked at me like I'd suggested paying with Monopoly money. "That's so sweet, Robert, but we've got it covered," she'd said, then turned to Michael. "Your dad means well, but this isn't really his expertise." Michael had nodded absently, already lost in discussions of vendor selections and venue logistics that excluded me as thoroughly as if I'd been speaking a foreign language. The campaign to minimize my role in their lives started after the honeymoon. Sunday dinners became monthly visits and became whenever you're in the neighborhood. My phone calls went to voicemail for days. When I did see Michael, Jessica steered conversations toward their European vacations, their country club friends, their renovation plans. I watched my son's language change. He stopped talking about working with his hands and started saying he solved complex engineering problems. He stopped mentioning the house I'd helped him buy and started talking about their investment properties. When his colleagues asked about his family, I noticed he talked about Jessica's parents, the attorney and psychiatrist, but rarely mentioned his father, who'd raised him alone. The final straw should have been last Christmas dinner. Jessica had had too much wine and let her guard down just enough to make a comment about how some people never learn their place in the world. When I'd asked what she meant, she tilted her head and curved her lips into that familiar smile. "Oh, just thinking about a character in a novel I'm reading," she said, waving her hand dismissively. But I'd caught the look that passed between her and her mother, a slight nod between two women who knew exactly how to manage inconvenient people. Jessica's mother had smiled and raised her glass. "To know where we belong," she'd said. Even then, I'd told myself I was imagining things. Jessica was family now. She wouldn't deliberately hurt me. She was just sophisticated, different from the world I'd grown up in. 3 weeks ago, I was walking out of the hardware store when I saw Jessica's red BMW parked outside Romano's. Through the window, I saw her at a corner table with a man who wasn't my son. He was well-dressed, wearing scrubs under his jacket. Jessica's hand covered his across the white tablecloth. She leaned forward when he spoke, touched his face when she thought no one was looking. I sat in my truck for 2 hours, watching. I followed them to the Marriott downtown, where they disappeared into the elevator together for 3 hours. That night, I called Michael. He was excited about Jessica's upcoming Chicago trip, proud of the major commercial deal she was closing, thrilled about the commission that would finally let them start trying for children. Chicago, where Dr. Marcus Coleman had moved 5 years ago according to his Facebook profile. The same Marcus Coleman whose photos showed him with Jessica at their college reunion just 6 months after her wedding to my son. For the first time in 3 years, I stopped making excuses for her. The daughter I'd thought I'd gained had never existed. The woman who'd called me the father she never had been playing a role, and I'd been too grateful for the family to see through it. I hired a private investigator with money from my retirement savings. The photos arrived 1 week later. Jessica and Marcus at Gibson's Steakhouse. Jessica and Marcus walking hand in hand through Millennium Park. Jessica and Marcus entered the Ritz-Carlton together on Thursday evening, not emerging until Friday afternoon. The hotel receipts were easy to obtain. Jessica had been careless, using her own credit card for room service while Marcus paid for the suite. The phone records told the rest of the story, hours of calls between them, starting 2 weeks after Jessica's marriage to Michael. Now, sitting at this perfectly appointed dinner table, I felt the weight of that envelope like evidence in a murder trial. Opening it would destroy my son's marriage, but leaving it closed meant watching him live a lie for the rest of his life. Jessica stared at me across the table, her mind working behind those calculating eyes. She'd forgotten that the man she'd been systematically humiliating had spent decades solving other people's problems, fixing what was broken, making things work when everyone else had given up. "Robert," she said, her voice honey-sweet, "I think you might want to be very careful about whatever you think you know. Sometimes our imagination plays tricks, especially when we're feeling forgotten." She set down her wineglass with deliberate precision. The threat was wrapped in concern, but the message was clear. I was expendable, and she had the power to make me disappear from Michael's life entirely. But she'd miscalculated. She'd assumed that a man who'd lost everything and rebuilt it from nothing would be afraid to lose it again. She'd forgotten that the useless old man she'd been dismissing had raised the son she was betraying, built the foundation she was living on, and learned long ago that sometimes love means fighting for the people who can't fight for themselves. She was wrong. "Let's take this conversation somewhere private," I said, standing slowly from my chair. The dining room walls seemed to close in around us. Jessica's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Oh, Robert, I don't think that's necessary. We're all family here." She gestured around the table with a sweep of her diamond bracelet. "Whatever little misunderstanding you're having, I'm sure we can clear it up right here." But Michael was already rising from his seat, his engineer's mind working through variables he couldn't yet calculate. "Dad, what's in the envelope? Jessica, what's going on?" The room held its breath. Emma's phone had vanished completely. Her young face had gone pale, her eyes darting between the adults like she was watching a tennis match played with grenades. "It's nothing, honey," Jessica said, her voice taking on the patient tone teachers use with slow children. "Your father has been having some difficulties lately. Haven't you, Robert?" She tilted her head with mock sympathy. "Memory issues, paranoid thoughts. It's quite common in men his age." The words landed like calculated punches. I watched uncomfortable glances pass between my family members, the seeds of doubt she'd planted beginning to sprout. "I'm 64, not 94, I said, my voice cutting through her manipulation. "And my memory is just fine. Good enough to remember exactly what you were doing at the Ritz-Carlton in Chicago on March 15th, with Dr. Marcus Coleman." Jessica's wine glass tilted in her suddenly unsteady hand, dark red liquid threatening to spill. Michael blinked twice, his mouth opening slightly. "Marcus?" Michael said slowly. "Your college boyfriend, Marcus?" Jessica's mouth opened and closed twice before sound emerged. "That's ridiculous. Marcus is an old friend. We had coffee when I was in Chicago. It's called networking, Robert, something you might understand if you'd ever progressed beyond manual labor." "Coffee at the Ritz-Carlton," I said, opening the envelope with deliberate slowness. "That must have been some expensive coffee. $350 for 1 cup, according to your credit card statement." The first photograph landed on the table face up. Jessica and Marcus walked through the hotel lobby, her hand on his arm, both of them laughing. The timestamp in the corner read March 15th, 2:17 p.m. Michael's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Jesus Christ, Jessica." "It's not what it looks like," she said quickly, her fingers drumming against the table. "We were discussing a potential investment opportunity. Marcus has been very successful, and I thought Michael might be interested in—" The second photograph cut off her explanation. Jessica and Marcus kissing in the hotel elevator, her hand tangled in his hair, both of them pressed together. Emma pushed back from the table and fled toward the kitchen, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her wedding ring catching the light as she reached for Tom. "You son of a bitch," Michael whispered, but he was looking at the photographs, not at me. "How long?" Color flooded Jessica's cheeks. "Michael, let me explain." "How long?" he repeated, his voice rising. I laid out the third photograph. Jessica and Marcus at dinner, sharing dessert across an intimate table for two. Then the fourth. Jessica leaves the hotel the next morning, her hair different, wearing clothes she hadn't been wearing when she'd arrived. "According to the phone records," I said quietly, "the first call was made 2 weeks after your wedding. They've been talking almost daily ever since." The words hung in the air like smoke. Michael stared at his wife as if she'd suddenly sprouted horns. Sarah's fingers drummed against her water glass in rapid staccato. Tom had discovered a new fascination with his dinner plate. "I can explain everything," Jessica said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "Marcus and we have history, yes, but it's complicated. You don't understand the pressure I've been under, trying to fit into your family, dealing with your father's constant disapproval." "Don't you dare," Michael said, stepping closer to the table. "Don't you dare try to make this about my father." She turned to me, her smile gone completely. "This is all you're doing, isn't it?" she hissed. "You never accepted me, never thought I was good enough for your precious son. You've been looking for ways to destroy our marriage since day one." The accusation was designed to shift blame, to make me the villain. But it also revealed something else. Just how carefully she'd been playing the long game, how meticulously she'd been working to isolate Michael from his family. "I hired the investigator 3 weeks ago," I said, keeping my hands flat on the table. "But I didn't need to look very hard. You've been careless, Jessica, arrogant. You thought the stupid old man would never figure it out. You hired someone to spy on my wife?" Michael turned back to me, his hands clenched into fists. This was the moment I'd feared most. The moment when my son might choose his lying wife over his faithful father. "I saw them together first," I said. 3 weeks ago, at Romano's. Then I followed them to the Marriott. I needed proof before I could tell you, son. I needed to be sure." The room was silent, except for the tick of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of Emma crying in the kitchen. Jessica's eyes moved from Michael to me and back again. Michael was staring at the phone records, his pen tapping against the table as he traced the dates with his finger. "The Chicago trip," he said slowly. "You said you were closing the Hartwell deal." "I was," Jessica protested weakly. "I did close it. The fact that I also saw Marcus doesn't mean—" "The Hartwell deal was signed electronically 2 days before you left," Michael said, his voice flat. "You showed me the contracts, remember? You said you were going to Chicago to celebrate." The lie unraveled in real time, each thread pulling loose to reveal the ugly truth beneath. Jessica had constructed her deception carefully, but she'd underestimated both her husband's memory and her father-in-law's determination. "Michael," she said, reaching for his hand, "please, let me explain properly. Away from him." She couldn't even say my name anymore. I'd become such an obstacle that acknowledging my existence felt like giving me power she couldn't afford to surrender. But Michael pulled his hand away from hers like he'd been burned. "Explain what, exactly? How you've been screwing your ex-boyfriend for 3 years while I thought we were building a life together." The profanity hung in the air like a slap. Michael never cursed, especially not at family dinners. Jessica's eyes widened at the vehemence in his voice. "It's not that simple," she started. "It is exactly that simple," Michael cut her off. "You made vows to me, Jessica. You stood in front of our families and promised to forsake all others, Was any of it real? The phone records were the knife that cut deepest. I spread them across the table like a dealer laying out cards in a high-stakes poker game. Column after column of incoming and outgoing calls, text message timestamps, data usage patterns. February 14th, I read aloud, running my finger down the list. Valentine's Day. 47 minutes to Marcus Coleman's number while Michael was at his company retreat in Denver. February 28th, 1 hour and 12 minutes. March 7th, 2 hours and 16 minutes. Michael leaned over my shoulder, his breathing becoming more labored with each entry. His coffee cup sat forgotten, cooling in his white-knuckled grip. The night before you went to Chicago, I continued, you talked to him for 3 hours and 14 minutes. You told Michael you were reviewing contracts and went to bed early, remember? Jessica had gone completely still, like a deer in headlights. Her perfect posture had crumbled, shoulders hunched forward as if she could make herself disappear. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus and I, we never meant for this to happen. We met again at the reunion and all those old feelings came flooding back. It's not about love, Michael. It's about unfinished business." Michael's face had gone white, his hands clenched around the coffee cup. "Unfinished business," Michael repeated, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. "You married me while you had unfinished business with another man?" "It's not that simple. It is that simple." Michael's voice exploded across the dinner table, causing the crystal glasses to ring like tiny church bells. "You made vows to me, Jessica. You stood in front of our families and promised to forsake all others. Was any of it real?" I watched my son's heart break in real time. His hands shook as he picked up photograph after photograph, studying them as if he could find some innocent explanation hidden in the evidence. But Jessica wasn't finished. She'd apparently decided that if she was going down, she'd take everyone with her. "You want to know what's real?" she said, her voice gaining strength as she found her footing. "What's real is that your father has been trying to destroy our marriage from day one. He's never accepted me, never thought I was good enough for his precious son. This whole investigation is just his latest attempt to get me out of the picture." She was redirecting attention to my motives, making me the villain in a story where she was clearly the wrongdoer. "Look around this table," she continued, sweeping her hand in a wide arc. "Look how happy he is right now. He's been waiting 3 years for this moment, waiting for his chance to prove that I'm not worthy of this family." "That's enough," Sarah said sharply, standing up from her chair. "I've watched you treat my father like garbage for 3 years, Jessica. Don't you dare try to flip this around and make him the villain." Jessica turned to Sarah with surprise. "Sarah, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Sarah cut her off. "Every family dinner, every holiday, every visit. The little comments, the dismissive looks, the way you redirect conversations away from Dad like he's some embarrassing relative. Tom and I have talked about it countless times." Tom nodded grimly. "We've seen it, Jessica. The way you treat Robert when you think no one's paying attention." Even Michael was looking at me with something that might have been suspicious, but Sarah stepped closer to my chair. "Dad has never said a single negative word about you, Jessica. Not once. Even when we asked him directly if everything was okay." "That's not true," I said, but the words felt weak against her practiced manipulation. "Isn't it?" Jessica leaned forward, her voice rising. "Tell me, Robert, when did you start following me? When did you decide that spying on your son's wife was an appropriate use of your time?" The question was designed to make me look like an obsessed stalker rather than a concerned father who'd stumbled upon evidence of betrayal. "I saw you by accident," I said. "I was coming out of the hardware store and I saw your car at Romano's. I looked through the window and saw you with another man. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to mind your own business," Jessica snapped. "You were supposed to trust that your adult son could manage his own marriage without interference from a bitter old man who can't accept that his child has moved on." The words hit their target. I felt the familiar sting of her carefully crafted insults designed to make me question my own worth and motivations. But then Michael spoke up, and his words cut through Jessica's manipulation like a sword through silk. "Dad didn't make you screw Marcus Coleman," he said quietly. "Dad didn't make you lie to me for 3 years. Dad didn't make you take phone calls from your lover while I was sleeping next to you in our bed." Jessica's mouth opened and closed without sound. Her entire defense strategy crumbled under the weight of simple truth. "Michael," she tried again, "you have to understand the pressure I've been under. Trying to fit into your family, dealing with your father's constant judgment, living up to expectations that were impossible to meet." "Stop," Michael said, holding up his hand. "Just stop. Don't blame him for your choices. Don't blame anyone but yourself." But Jessica had one more card to play, and she played it with the desperation of someone fighting for their life. "Fine," she said, her voice taking on a cold, clinical tone. "You want the truth? The whole truth? Your father isn't the only one who's been keeping secrets." Michael's hands gripped the edge of the table. I felt sweat break out on my forehead. "What are you talking about?" Michael asked. Jessica smiled, but it wasn't the warm expression she'd worn for 3 years of family dinners. "Ask your father about the real reason he started following me," she said. "Ask him about the letter he sent to Marcus 3 months ago, trying to buy him off. Ask him about the private investigator he's had watching us for over a year, not 3 weeks." The accusations landed like physical blows. Michael stared at me with growing horror, and I could feel the foundation of trust between us beginning to crack. "That's not true," I said, but I could even hear the uncertainty in my voice. "Isn't it?" Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "Marcus told me about the letter, Robert. The one where you offered him $50,000 to stay away from me. The one where you threatened to destroy his medical career if he didn't cooperate." She scrolled through text messages with practiced efficiency. "He saved everything, you know, screenshots of your letters, recordings of your phone calls. He thought it was sweet how protective you were of your son. He had no idea how far you were willing to go." The room was spinning around me. I'd never sent any letters to Marcus Coleman. I'd never offered him money. I'd never even known his last name until 3 weeks ago. But Jessica was presenting her lies with such conviction that even I was beginning to doubt my own memory. "Show us," Michael said, his voice hoarse. "Show us the letter." Jessica's finger hovered over her phone screen. She hesitated, Michael noticed. "I don't think that's necessary," she said finally. "I think we've all heard enough truth for one evening." "Show us," he repeated, his voice harder now. "If my father really did what you're claiming, show us the proof." Jessica's phone screen went black in her trembling hands. The confident mask she'd worn for 3 years was finally slipping away like makeup in the rain. "The messages were deleted," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus thought it would be better if there was no evidence of your harassment." "How convenient," Michael said dryly. "No proof of Dad's alleged bribery attempts, but plenty of evidence of your affair." I could see the exact moment when Jessica realized her final gambit had failed. Her shoulders sagged as if she'd been carrying an enormous weight that had suddenly become too heavy to bear. "There is no letter," I said quietly. "There are no phone calls. There's no conspiracy. There's just a father who loves his son enough to tell him the truth, even when it hurts." But Jessica wasn't finished yet. Backed into a corner with nowhere to run, she made one last desperate attempt to burn down everything around her. "You want to know the real truth?" she screamed, her composure finally shattering completely. "Fine. Yes, I've been seeing Marcus. Yes, I love him. I've always loved him. Marrying Michael was supposed to be temporary, a stepping stone until Marcus finished his residency and could support me properly." The words hit the table like grenades. Michael's fork clattered against his plate, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. "A stepping stone," he repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "Our marriage was a stepping stone." "Michael, I didn't mean it like that." "You absolutely meant it like that," he cut her off. "How long? How long have you been planning to leave me for him?" Jessica's mouth worked silently before she found her voice. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. Marcus was supposed to move back to Chicago after his residency, but then Northwestern offered him the department head position, and everything changed." The clinical way she discussed my son's life as a temporary inconvenience was breathtaking. For 3 years, she'd shared his bed, attended his work functions, met his friends and colleagues, all while planning to abandon him the moment something better came along. The house, Michael said suddenly, his mind working through the implications. Your name is on the deed, half of everything. Jessica's eyes flickered with something that might have been guilt, but was more likely calculation. Community property laws in this state are very clear. You gold-digging bitch, Sarah said from across the table, her voice shaking. I'd never heard my daughter use language like that, but watching someone systematically destroy her brother's life had apparently pushed her past her breaking point. I am not a gold digger, Jessica snapped. I have my own career, my own money. Money you made while living rent-free in a house my brother paid for, Sarah shot back. Money you made while he covered all the household expenses so you could build your precious real estate empire. Michael's mind was working through the financial implications. He'd not only been betrayed emotionally, but financially exploited by a woman who'd been planning to leave him from the day they'd exchanged vows. There's more, I said quietly, reaching into the envelope one final time. The private investigator was very thorough. The bank statements were the final nail in the coffin. For the past year, Jessica had been systematically moving money from their joint accounts into a personal savings account that Michael knew nothing about. Small amounts at first, but gradually increasing to larger transfers. You've been stealing from me, Michael said, his voice flat. While planning to leave me for another man, you've been stealing my money. It's our money, Jessica protested weakly. I was just securing our future. Whose future? Michael's voice was rising again. Mine and yours, or yours and Marcus's? The question hung in the air unanswered, because we all knew the answer already. Every dollar Jessica had hidden away had been funded by my son's trust and hard work. I want you out, Michael said suddenly, his voice cutting through the chaos. Tonight. Pack a bag and get out of my house. Michael, please. No, he said, standing up from the table with such force that his chair tipped backward. No more lies. No more manipulation. No more anything. Get your things and get out. Jessica looked around the table one final time, searching for any ally who might help her salvage the situation. But Sarah was glaring at her with undisguised hatred. Tom was studying his hands. Emma was still hiding in the kitchen. You'll regret this, Jessica said finally, her voice taking on a cold, threatening tone. Both of you. The divorce will cost you everything, Michael. Half the house, half your retirement, spousal support for years, and don't think this will stay quiet. Everyone at the country club, your work colleagues, they'll all know exactly what kind of family you come from. The last accusation was a bridge too far. Michael moved around the table with surprising speed, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike her. Don't, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Don't you dare talk about my family. Don't you dare pretend you know anything about our history. But Jessica had found her target. She'd always known exactly which buttons to push to cause maximum damage. Your mother chose to die rather than abort you, Jessica said with calculated cruelty. She chose death over your father's wishes. How does it feel to know that your entire life is built on someone else's sacrifice? The silence that followed was absolute. Michael's face had gone completely white, and I could see 36 years of buried guilt and confusion rising to the surface. That's enough, I said, standing up slowly. That's enough, Jessica. But she wasn't finished. Having finally abandoned all pretense of civility, she was determined to inflict as much damage as possible before her inevitable defeat. And you, she turned to me with venom. You pathetic old man, do you think Michael respects you? Do you think he loves you? He's embarrassed by you. He's been embarrassed by you for years. The trailer park past, the blue-collar job, the way you don't fit into our world. He keeps you around out of guilt, not love. The words were designed to cut deep, to shatter the relationship between father and son that she'd been working to undermine for 3 years. But she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She'd underestimated the bond between a man and the child he'd raised alone through 18 years of struggle and sacrifice. Get out, Michael said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. Get out now before I call the police and have you removed. Jessica grabbed her purse from the sideboard, her movement sharp and angry. This isn't over, she said. The divorce is going to cost you everything. Half the house, half your retirement, half your future. I hope your precious father was worth it. She stalked toward the front door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like gunshots. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house like thunder, followed by the roar of her BMW engine as she peeled out of the driveway. The silence that followed was profound. We sat in the wreckage of what had been a family dinner, surrounded by photographs and bank statements and the bitter aftertaste of 3 years' worth of lies finally exposed. Michael was staring at the table, his hands shaking as he processed everything that had just happened. His marriage was over. His trust had been shattered. His financial future was uncertain. But he was free. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 times, marking the end of the longest evening of our lives. Emma had emerged from the kitchen, with red-rimmed eyes, silently beginning to clear the dinner plates that still held Jessica's perfectly prepared salmon, now cold and forgotten under the chandelier light. Michael hadn't moved from his position at the head of the table, surrounded by the debris of his shattered marriage. The photographs, bank statements, and phone records were scattered across the white tablecloth like evidence from a crime scene. "I'm sorry, son," I said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between us for nearly 10 minutes. "I'm sorry I had to be the one to show you this." He looked up at me with eyes that held pain and something else, something that looked remarkably like relief. "How long have you known? Really?" 3 weeks, I said honestly. I saw them at Romano's completely by accident. If I hadn't needed that specific type of screw for Mrs. Patterson's kitchen cabinet, I never would have been downtown that day. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Mrs. Patterson's cabinet, the one she's been complaining about for 6 months. The very one. Sometimes the universe has a strange way of protecting people who can't protect themselves." Sarah had been quiet throughout the aftermath, but now she reached across the table and took her brother's hand. "Are you okay?" Michael considered the question seriously. "I don't know. I should be devastated, right? My wife just admitted that our entire marriage was a lie. She's been stealing from me, cheating on me, planning to leave me for another man. I should be falling apart." "But you're not," I observed. "No," he said slowly. "I'm not, and that's what's really messing with my head. Part of me feels relieved, like a weight I didn't even know I was carrying has finally been lifted." Emma paused in her cleaning, looking at her stepfather with the perceptive eyes of a teenager who'd been watching the adults in her life more carefully than they'd realized. "She was never nice to Grandpa," she said quietly. "Or to me, really. Only when you were watching, Dad." The truth hit home with startling clarity. Jessica had been performing the role of loving wife and stepmother, but only when her audience demanded it. Behind closed doors, away from Michael's protective gaze, she'd been systematically cruel to anyone who threatened her control. "I should have seen it," Michael said, running his hands through his hair. 3 years, and I never saw what she really was." "Love makes us blind to things we don't want to see," I said. "Your mother used to say that the heart has its own logic, and sometimes that logic doesn't make sense to anyone else." At the mention of Linda, Michael's expression darkened. "What Jessica said about Mom, about her choosing to die—" "Is bullshit," I interrupted, using language that made Emma's eyes widen. "Your mother chose life, son. She chose to give you life, even when it was dangerous for her. She died because of complications that no one could have predicted, not because she preferred death to having you. But you wanted her to terminate the pregnancy." The old guilt was still there, buried under 36 years of love and pride, but still sharp enough to cut. "I was scared," I admitted. "I was 28 years old, and the doctors were telling me I might lose both of you. I wanted your mother to be safe, but she was braver than me and smarter. She knew that bringing you into the world was worth any risk. Even dying for it? She didn't die for it, Michael. She died despite it. There's a difference." Sarah was crying quietly, grieving for the mother she'd lost when she was only 2 years old, but also celebrating the brother who'd finally been freed from a toxic relationship. "What happens now?" Emma asked, her practical teenager mind already moving to logistics. "Where am I going to live during visitation weeks?" The question brought us all back to the reality of what came next. Divorce proceedings, custody arrangements, financial settlements. The messy business of untangling 3 years of shared life with someone who'd never been genuinely invested in building a future together. "You'll live here," Michael said firmly. "This is your home, Emma. And given everything that's happened tonight, I doubt any court would award Jessica visitation rights with you. We'll figure out the rest as we go." Emma's shoulders relaxed visibly. "Good. I was worried I'd have to live with her sometimes. She never really wanted me around anyway." Michael's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" Emma hesitated, glancing around the table. "I probably shouldn't say anything now." "Emma," Michael said gently, "please, tell me." "She was never mean when you were watching," Emma said carefully. "But when you weren't home, she'd make comments about how I ate too much, left too many lights on, used too much hot water. She said I was costing you money you couldn't afford because of my expensive taste in everything." Michael's face went pale. "She said that? And she'd always add that I shouldn't tell you because it would just stress you out more." Emma's voice got smaller. "She said you already felt guilty about the divorce affecting me, and hearing that I was being difficult would just make you feel worse about your failed first marriage." I watched my son's hands clench into fists. "Emma, why didn't you tell me?" "Because every time you came home, she'd be so sweet to me. She'd ask about my homework, offer to help with projects, talk about college plans. I thought maybe I was being too sensitive, you know? And she was right. I didn't want to stress you out more." "Jesus," Sarah whispered. She was gaslighting a teenager. Michael ran his hands through his hair. "All those times I thought you were just being moody or distant. You were protecting me from the truth about my own wife." "She wasn't just protecting you," I said quietly. "Emma, remember when Jessica accidentally threw away your science project last year, the one you'd worked on for weeks?" Emma's eyes widened. "You knew about that?" "I saw her do it, through the kitchen window when I was fixing the fence. She waited until you went upstairs, then dumped the whole thing in the garbage." I looked at Michael. I dug it out later, dried off what I could, helped Emma rebuild the damaged parts in my garage. "Grandpa made me promise not to tell," Emma said softly. "He said it would just cause more problems." "And the time your bike chain kept mysteriously coming loose?" I continued. "Jessica was loosening it every few days. I started checking it every time I came over, tightening it back up before you noticed." Michael's face had gone from pale to red. "She was sabotaging my daughter's things?" "She was trying to make Emma look careless, forgetful, make you think Emma wasn't taking care of her belongings." I reached over and squeezed Emma's hand. "But this kid never complained, never asked why her stuff kept breaking. She just dealt with it." "I didn't want to be in more trouble," Emma whispered. Sarah was staring at me with new understanding. "How long have you known she was like this?" "The sabotage started about a year ago, but I've been watching, trying to protect Emma without making waves. Every random visit, every time I offered to help with yard work or fix something around the house, I was checking on her." 6 months later, we learned through Michael's lawyer that Jessica had indeed moved to Chicago to be with Marcus. Their relationship had lasted exactly 3 weeks before Marcus discovered she'd been lying to him about her marriage being already over when their affair started. By then, Jessica had quit her real estate job and burned most of her professional bridges in town. Marcus, it turned out, had saved all her messages, not as evidence of my imaginary harassment, but as proof of her deception when he realized she'd been manipulating both him and Michael. He'd ended things immediately and even offered to testify in the divorce proceedings if needed. "I can help," I offered, "with whatever you need. Lawyer's fees, household expenses, moral support when you want to key her car." That earned me a genuine laugh from my son, the first one I'd heard all evening. "I don't think keying her car is going to solve anything, Dad." "Maybe not, but it would feel good." The conversation gradually shifted from the immediate trauma to practical concerns. Michael would need to change all the passwords on their joint accounts, secure his retirement funds, and document everything for the inevitable divorce proceedings. Sarah offered to help with research on family law attorneys. Emma volunteered to pack up Jessica's remaining belongings. But underneath the logistics, something more important was happening. The family that Jessica had been systematically dividing was coming back together, unified by the shared experience of surviving her manipulation and emerging stronger. "I owe you an apology," Michael said suddenly. "For the past 3 years, I let her push you away. I should have seen what she was doing, should have stood up for you more." "You were protecting your marriage," I said. "There's no shame in that." "I was being a coward," he corrected. "I knew she didn't like you, but I told myself it would get better with time. I convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for what was right." "Well," I said, gathering up the photographs and bank statements, "you stood up for what was right tonight. That's what matters." As we cleaned up the dinner table together, I reflected on the strange turns life could take. This morning, I'd been a lonely widower, gradually being pushed to the margins of my son's life by a woman who saw me as an obstacle. Tonight, I was part of a family again, welcomed back into the circle of trust and love that Jessica had worked so hard to destroy. The envelope that had started everything was now empty, its contents having served their purpose. Justice hadn't required revenge or elaborate schemes. It had simply required truth, presented at the right moment by someone who loved his son enough to risk everything to save him. Michael walked me to my truck as the others finished cleaning up inside. The night air was cool and crisp, full of the promise of spring and new beginnings. "Are you going to be okay?" I asked. "Really okay?" He considered the question seriously. "I think so. It's going to be hard, dealing with the divorce and everything that comes after, but for the first time in 3 years, I feel like I can breathe again. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," I said. "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is admit that something we wanted to work just isn't working." "Thanks, Dad," he said, giving me a hug that felt like coming home after a long journey. "For everything. For having the courage to tell me the truth when no one else would." As I drove home through the quiet streets of the suburban neighborhood where my son was rebuilding his life, I thought about the woman who died to bring him into the world. Linda would have been proud of the man he'd become, honest, kind, strong enough to face hard truths and make difficult decisions. Jessica had called me a loser, and for a moment tonight, I'd almost believed her. But sitting in that dining room, watching my son choose truth over comfort, family over facade, I'd remembered something important. Winners aren't the people who never get knocked down. Winners are the people who get back up, dust themselves off, and keep fighting for what matters most. And family, real family, built on love and sacrifice and honest affection, always matters most. The next Sunday, I cooked dinner for the first time in 3 years. Nothing fancy, just pot roast and mashed potatoes, the kind of simple meal that Jessica had always criticized as pedestrian. Michael brought Emma. Sarah drove up from Portland with Tom and the kids, and we filled my small house with laughter and conversation and the comfortable chaos of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Nobody mentioned Jessica. We didn't need to. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, surrounded by people who love you for exactly who you are. If you enjoyed this story, I hope you'll give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to hear more stories like this one. I'd love to hear your thoughts about family loyalty, standing up for what's right, and the courage it takes to tell difficult truths. Have you ever had to expose a painful secret to protect someone you love? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if you want to hear another story about family drama and unexpected revelations, click on the video suggestion to your left. Thanks for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next story.